I'm Deputy Jack Justice with a lesson on Penal Code Section 207A, Simple Kidnapping. As explained in Calcrim number 1215, the jury instructions for this crime. To prove someone is guilty of this crime, the people must prove that 1. The defendant took, held, or detained another person by using force or by instilling reasonable fear. 2. Using that force or fear, the defendant moved the other person or made the other person move a substantial distance, and if there is question of consent. 3. The other person did not consent to the movement. And 4. The defendant did not actually and reasonably believe that the other person consented to the movement. In order to consent, a person must act freely and voluntarily and know the nature of the act. For the purposes of kidnapping, substantial distance means more than a slight or trivial distance. The legal term for this is asportation. In deciding whether the distance was substantial, the jury must consider all the circumstances relating to the movement. Thus, in addition to considering the actual distance moved, the jury may also consider other factors, such as whether the distance the other person was moved was beyond that merely incidental to the commission of the crime, whether the movement increased the risk of physical or psychological harm, increased the danger of a foreseeable escape attempt, or gave the attacker a greater opportunity to commit additional crimes, or decreased the likelihood of detection. The accused can raise the good faith belief in consent defense. In this scenario, the defendant is not guilty of kidnapping if they reasonably and actually believe that the other person consented to the movement. The people have the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant did not reasonably and actually believe that the other person consented to the movement. If the people have not met this burden, the jury must find the defendant not guilty of this crime. Another defense to this crime is consent given. In this scenario, the defendant is not guilty of kidnapping if the other person consented to go with the defendant. The other person consented if he/she 1. Freely and voluntarily agreed to go with or be moved by the defendant, 2. Was aware of the movement, and 3. Had sufficient maturity and understanding to choose to go with the defendant. The people have the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that the other person did not consent to go with the defendant. If the people have not met this burden, you must find the defendant not guilty of this crime. Consent may be withdrawn. If at first a person agreed to go with the defendant, that consent ended if the person changed his or her mind and no longer freely and voluntarily agreed to go with or be moved by the defendant. The defendant is guilty of kidnapping if after the other person withdrew consent, the defendant committed the crime of kidnapping as described earlier. The defendant is not guilty of kidnapping if he/she was making a lawful citizen's arrest as described in Calcrim number 1226. The defendant was making a lawful citizen's arrest if he/she acted because the person arrested committed felony, or they had reasonable cause to believe person committed felony, or the person arrested committed or attempted to commit a misdemeanor or infraction in the defendant's presence. These are the same standards for PC 837 private persons, citizens' arrest. Someone has reasonable cause if he or she knows facts that would persuade someone of reasonable caution that the person to be arrested has committed a crime. Note that is a different standard than probable cause, a concept you learned about earlier in this class. Lesser included offenses of kidnapping include PC 237 false imprisonment. That is your lesson on the crime of kidnapping. I'm Deputy Jack Justice, and thanks for listening.